At his news conference, President Eisenhower defends espionage as brought sharply into focus with the downing of an American U-2 reconnaissance plane over Soviet territory.
Quite the introduction. You gotta love the 1950s newsreels. Today we're talking about the 1960 U-2 spy plane incident, the great forgotten scandal of the Dwight Eisenhower administration. We all know now about the China weather balloon seen flying over Montana and Latin America. China confirmed both were theirs, but that it was simply a curious and ambitious Chinese citizen who was responsible for the whole mess. This isn't the first time the U.S. has tangled with its enemies amidst a UFO seen flying over their airspace. The U.S. was getting increasingly nervous about the Soviet Union. In the year before, Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba and quickly displayed a warm friendship with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Laika became the first living thing launched in space by the Russians. Spoiler alert, the dog dies. So Dwight Eisenhower wanted to have an informational advantage over the Russians in anticipation of the upcoming summit he would have with Russia along with Great Britain. So the administration commissioned Operation Grand Slam. Makes you want to go to Denny's. They felt that it would be foolproof. They had just developed the U-2 spy plane. And within the spy plane, in order to gather a certain amount of information, a built-in camera in the bottom of the plane and through the windows would be made to get all the information that was needed. Of course, the assumption is if the plane somehow was shot down by a Russian missile, the camera along with it would be destroyed. Therefore, the U.S. could deny any sort of culpability. So the CIA enlisted civilian Gary Francis Powers, who was in the Air Force. He served his country pretty honorably, flying over 40 reconnaissance missions during the war. All systems were a go when Gary Francis Powers took off. He knew that he'd have little communication with the CIA or anybody else through radio waves because, of course, they had to be mute to not be intercepted by the Soviet Union. The guy was on his own. They picked a not great day to do everything because it was May Day. The extensive thinking was on May Day that all the Soviet officials would be busy and not really notice an aircraft flying about that wasn't there. Here's the problem. Because it was May Day, there was less Soviet air traffic than usual, making Powers' plane particularly noticeable. Powers was already spotted 15 miles away from the Soviet border and quickly met with 3 missiles when he tracked into their territory. One hit a fellow Soviet interceptor, and one didn't hit him, but one detonated close behind the plane, creating the perfect situation for the Soviets. Mr. Powers remembered hearing a hollow sound and seeing an explosion in orange flash. That flash was strong enough, the power of it, strong enough to send his plane flying down. And worst of all, send his plane flying down with the camera fully intact. Soviet agents were quickly dispatched to the rural area where Powers crashed. Luckily for them, the camera was still intact. Now the U.S. had been aware that a plane had gone down, but they assumed that Powers was dead and that there'd be no problem. To respond to the press about the downed plane, the USA government simply said that it was a NASA plane getting weather information in nearby Turkey and that had somehow drifted accidentally into Soviet airspace. The US went all the way with this cover-up, even creating a fake photo of this NASA plane. Meanwhile, Khrushchev gleefully sat back and let the United States hang themselves. On May 7th, a handful of days after the whole scene, Khrushchev announced that Gary Powers was actually alive. And Khrushchev said in a press conference, "Comrades, I must tell you a secret. When I was making my report, I deliberately did not say the pilot was still alive, in that we have parts of the plane. We did so deliberately because had we told everything all at once, the Americans would have invented another version. And now just look at the silly things they had said." Indeed, Eisenhower was caught flat-footed, but to his credit, unlike perhaps future administrations, he quickly owned up to the mistake.
When we admitted publicly that the U-2 belonged to us and it was on a reconnaissance mission, we were doing something that in a modern world, that was the only way we could find out, get any information on about a closed society.
Nikita Khrushchev was certainly having fun with the situation.
On display in Moscow, the wreckage of pilot Francis Powers' U-2 reconnaissance plane for Muscovites and foreign newsmen to see as the Soviet launches its most belligerent anti-American propaganda barrage in recent years.
In spite of all that, Eisenhower still had high hopes for the summit.
The hopes of humanity call on the four of us to purge our minds of prejudice and our hearts of rancor. Far too much is at stake to indulge in profitless bickering.
But those hopes were never to come into fruition, potentially stopping a serious breakthrough of peace between the US and Russia because of this cover-up mission. It's always interesting to wonder what could have been.
Then Khrushchev deliberately torpedoed the first meeting with an insulting tirade directed at President Eisenhower personally. He withdrew his invitation to the president to visit the Soviet Union and demanded a public apology for the U-2 spy flights. Ike disclosed future U-2 flights had been canceled, but the summit talks seemed on the verge of collapse.
Still, Ike wasn't particularly apologetic.
No one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attack. Secrecy in the Soviet Union makes this essential.
As the nation moved on, Powers was convicted in a Russian show trial. His attorney made a valiant effort. He said that because of Powers' simple beginnings, he was more of a proletarian, better connected to the Russian people than the average American might be. It didn't work, although Powers unexpectedly did get to see his family in the courtroom. They went all the way to Russia to show their support.
In Moscow's Trade Union House, scene of the secret purge trials of the 30s, the father of Francis W. Powers is present for the elaborately staged spy trial of the U-2 pilot. Powers' wife and his mother are also present, but none of them has spoken with him. Incommunicado, he is the central figure in a courtroom drama whose red-written script is intended to indict the policies of the United States.
Although Powers has a bit of a happy ending. Although he was not liked by the American people, Powers eventually did get his freedom in a prison swap in 1962. In fact, the film Bridge of Spies, starring Tom Hanks, the attorney for the Russian citizen, is based on this. So, quite a famous moment in history itself as well. And the negotiations between the two powers took place on the bridge connecting Berlin to the rest of the Eastern Russian bloc. Powers had a pretty peaceful life. Towards the end, Powers had a pretty peaceful life, becoming a local TV news traffic reporter. He died tragically in 1977 from a helicopter crash, the helicopter of which he was piloting. Maybe his first capture should have been a sign. Thank you guys, though, for watching this YouTube video. And thank you all for following me. This is kind of the first video after my introduction and all the crazy stuff that happened with me in Scientology. So thank you for your interest, and we'll have multiple videos putting things into a historical perspective. This week I also have an interview with a young lady that I know out in Mexico who was actually kidnapped by the cartel for 2 years. That should be a really interesting, substantive interview to chew on, which should be out in the next few days. So yeah, thank you all for paying attention to my channel, and I hope you enjoyed its second video. You take care.